Right now, somewhere in America, there are an estimated 12,000 to 15,000 people who have completely vanished from the tax system, not through fraud, not through offshore accounts, but by simply walking into a forest and never coming back. Some of them have been gone for over 30 years, and the terrifying part isn't that they got caught, it's that most of them never did. The system built to find them was never designed to look somewhere no one was hiding. Welcome to Catastrophe Theory, where we figure out exactly how fast your life falls apart if you actually let the intrusive thoughts win. I'm CJ Theory, and today we're looking at what happens when you tell the IRS, no thank you, and disappear into the trees like the last 20 years of your life were just a rough draft. You're standing at the edge of a property line that only exists on paper. Behind you, a car with a lease payment, a mailbox stuffed with envelopes you've stopped opening, a job that emails you at 11 p.m. because someone forgot that boundaries exist. In front of you, about 400 acres of second-growth pine, a dirt logging road half swallowed by brush, and a silence so complete you can hear your own pulse in your ears. No notifications, no W-2, no line 17 asking what you owe. You take one step off the gravel and onto the pine needles, and something in your chest unclenches for the first time in years. That feeling, that specific seductive relief, is the entire reason this fantasy exists. It's not really about taxes, it's about disappearing from a system that feels too big, too automated, too indifferent to notice you as a person instead of a number. And I understand that pull, because I've spent years talking to the people who actually did it, not the online LARPers posting sovereign citizen paperwork templates, the real ones, the retired accountant living off-grid in the Ozarks who stopped filing in 1994, the former IT contractor who built a cabin in the Alaskan interior specifically so certified mail couldn't reach him, the woman in Eastern Oregon who's been growing her own food since Clinton was in office and has never once been audited, because you can't audit someone the system doesn't know exists yet. I've read their court records. I've read the ones who didn't make it, the men in federal filings whose case numbers end in decades of supervised release. And what I found wasn't a simple story about crime and punishment. It was something stranger, a slow-motion collision between two systems that were never built to interact, the legal architecture of the modern nation-state and the raw, indifferent physics of surviving alone in the woods. Today we're going to take both of those systems apart, piece by piece, and show you exactly what happens in what order when a human being decides to opt out of one and gamble everything on the other. Let's start with the myth you already believe, because it's the one that gets people the deepest into trouble the fastest. Most people imagine tax evasion as a dramatic chase, a knock at the door, agents with jackets that say IRS CI in block letters, handcuffs glinting under fluorescent light. That does happen, but it's the final scene of a much longer, much quieter movie, and understanding that movie is the entire key to understanding your risk. Here's the mechanical reality. The IRS doesn't primarily catch people through investigation, it catches them through absence. Think of the IRS not as a detective, but as an accountant with an obsessive filing system who notices eventually when a folder that used to get updated every April simply stops. Your employer files a W-2, your bank files a 1099 on interest, your mortgage company files a 1098. Every one of these is a third party reporting your existence to the system on your behalf, whether you cooperate or not. The IRS's matching program, called the Automated Underreporter system, cross-references all of it automatically every year for over 150 million returns. It doesn't need to suspect you, it just needs your paper trail to go quiet while everyone else around you keeps talking. This is part one of the anatomy. The silence, not the accusation, is what triggers the process. If you stop filing, but you also stop having a job, stop having a bank account under your name, stop having a social security number attached to anything, the system doesn't hunt you. It simply loses the thread. This is the loophole the woods offer. And it is real, but it is also incredibly narrow, and most people who try to walk through it don't realize how much of modern life they have to surgically remove to make it work. Part 2. What actually constitutes the crime? Because this is where most people's understanding collapses. There is a legal difference, a real prosecutable difference between tax avoidance, which is legal, and two distinct categories of tax non-compliance that are not. The first is failure to file, a misdemeanor under federal law, punishable by up to 1 year in prison per year unfiled plus fines. The second, more serious charge is tax evasion under 26 U.S.C. Section 7201, a felony requiring the government to prove you didn't just forget or fall behind, but that you took affirmative steps to conceal income or assets specifically to avoid the tax. Moving to a forest, cutting off contact, using cash exclusively, and refusing to register property in your name. A prosecutor can and does argue that this pattern of behavior is itself evidence of affirmative acts of evasion. The IRS doesn't just look at what you failed to do, it looks at what you built in order to fail to do it. This is the part almost no one explains clearly enough. The woods don't erase your tax liability. They just delay the moment someone notices, and interest and penalties compound the entire time you're gone. Failure to file penalties run 5% of unpaid tax per month up to 25%. Failure to pay penalties add another slow bleed on top of that. There is no statute of limitations on unfiled returns. The clock on IRS collection only starts once a return is actually filed or the IRS files a substitute return on your behalf using only third-party data, almost always calculated in the worst possible way for you, with no deductions, no dependents, no mercy. Some people who vanish for a decade come back to a debt that has quietly tripled in the dark. Microhook, because this is where the story usually turns. So if the system is slow and mostly automated and genuinely can lose track of a person who removes themselves cleanly enough, why do almost all of the people who try this eventually get found? The answer isn't in the tax code at all, it's in the woods themselves. This is where the second system takes over, the one that doesn't care about your ideology, your grievances, or your paperwork. Biology doesn't negotiate. Let's talk about what just moved to the woods actually requires mechanically, because this is where the fantasy and the reality start to diverge violently. Part 3. Caloric arithmetic. The average adult needs somewhere between 2,000 and 2,800 calories a day, depending on activity level. And subsistence living in a forest is extremely high activity. Felling trees, hauling water, hunting, foraging, building. Realistic estimates for people attempting true self-sufficiency run closer to 3,500 to 4,500 calories daily just to maintain body weight through a working season. A single white-tailed deer yields roughly 50 to 70 pounds of usable meat. Call it 400 to 500 pounds live weight, but the vast majority of that animal is bone, hide, and organ you likely can't or won't eat efficiently without significant skill. Foraged wild plants, even abundant ones, are calorically sparse. You could eat dandelion greens for a week and still be running a deficit steep enough to trigger the early stages of malnutrition. This is why every documented long-term forest hermit, and there have been more than you'd think, studied by anthropologists and criminologists alike, eventually developed some form of supply chain. Michael Finkel's research into the so-called North Pond Hermit, Christopher Knight, who lived alone in the Maine woods for 27 years, found that Knight survived not through hunting or foraging, but through over 1,000 documented burglaries of nearby cabins, stealing food, propane, and batteries. Total self-sufficiency, sustained for decades, essentially doesn't exist in the historical record without some form of contact with civilization, trading, stealing, or periodic supply runs. Part 4. Shelter and thermal physics. Hypothermia doesn't require a blizzard. Core body temperature begins dropping in air as mild as 50 degrees Fahrenheit if you're wet or under-insulated. And cognitive impairment, poor decision-making, slowed reaction time, the exact conditions under which people make fatal errors, begins well before the shivering does. A properly built and insulated shelter is not a weekend project. It's a structural engineering problem involving load-bearing capacity, moisture barriers, and thermal mass, and most first attempts fail in ways that aren't obvious until the first hard freeze. This is why survival experts consistently rank shelter above food and water in the hierarchy of wilderness threats. You can survive 3 weeks without food and 3 days without water, but you can die of exposure in 3 hours in the wrong conditions. Part 5. The medical clock. This is the one that ends most off-grid experiments, and it's rarely dramatic. It's a cavity that turns into an abscess. It's an appendicitis with the nearest hospital 4 hours away on foot. It's a chainsaw laceration with no clean way to close it. The average person underestimates how much of modern survival is invisibly propped up by infrastructure they've never had to think about. Clean water treatment preventing giardia and cryptosporidium, refrigeration preventing foodborne illness, basic first aid preventing minor injuries from becoming fatal ones. Rural EMS response times already average over 14 minutes nationally. True backcountry response times, if you can even summon help, are measured in hours, sometimes days. Here's the philosophical pivot buried inside all this data. The woods were never actually the escape from the system. They're a much older, much less forgiving system, one with no appeals process, no payment plan, no reasonable accommodation. You're not opting out of bureaucracy by moving to the forest. You're trading a system that mostly wants your money for one that will, without malice or notice, take everything else. Let's talk about who actually gets caught and why, because the pattern is remarkably consistent once you start reading federal court records. Ed and Elaine Brown, a couple in New Hampshire, refused to pay taxes for years, fortified their property, and ended up in a 9-month armed standoff with federal marshals in 2007 that ended with both of them arrested and sentenced to decades in prison. The trigger wasn't the unfiled returns themselves, it was the escalation. They turned quiet non-compliance into an active confrontation, and the moment a case becomes about defiance rather than absence, the federal calculus changes completely. Prosecutors pursue tax cases as deterrence. A visible, public standoff is the opposite of the profile that lets someone quietly disappear. Then there's the North Pond Hermit again. Christopher Knight, the most famous unintentional case study in exactly how long true isolation can actually last, and exactly what ends it. 27 years alone, no fire, ever, for fear of the smoke being seen, no conversation with another human being for nearly 30 decades. What ended it wasn't a tax audit or a manhunt, it was a motion sensor at a summer camp's food pantry triggered during one of his supply raids, and a game warden who'd been quietly building a profile of a ghost based on nothing but pattern recognition, footprints, missing peanut butter jars, a specific kind of quiet that locals had learned to notice. When they finally caught him, Knight told investigators he'd become so unaccustomed to speech that his voice came out strange, almost mechanical from disuse. That detail alone tells you something the legal statutes will never will. Isolation this complete doesn't just remove you from a database, it changes what you are, neurologically and socially, in ways that are extremely difficult to reverse. I want to sit with that for a second because it matters more than the legal risk. Prolonged social isolation has measurable effects on the human brain that mirror, in some studies, physical trauma. Reduced isolation correlates with elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep architecture, and in extended cases, genuine perceptual disturbances, not psychosis in the clinical sense, but the well-documented phenomenon researchers call sensory deprivation drift, where prolonged absence of social and environmental stimulation causes the brain to generate its own. Antarctic researchers, submariners, and long-term solo sailors have reported this for decades. The forest doesn't just remove your tax obligation, it removes almost every input your brain evolved expecting to receive. So here's the honest clinical urgency at the center of this entire topic. The fantasy of walking away from the system is really a fantasy about walking away from complexity, and the woods do offer that, but they replace administrative complexity with existential complexity, financial risk with mortal risk, and a slow bureaucratic process with an unforgiving biological one. That trade isn't stupid, it's understandable. Millions of people feel crushed by systems that seem designed to be incomprehensible, but understanding why the instinct exists is different from believing the escape actually works the way it looks in the daydream. Let's clear out the myths now, because this is where the bad advice lives, and bad advice in this specific fantasy doesn't just cost you money, it can cost you your freedom or your life. Myth number 1. If the IRS doesn't catch you within a few years, you're in the clear because there's a statute of limitations. Reality, there is no statute of limitations on an unfiled tax return. The 3-year audit clock and the 10-year collection clock only begin once a return has actually been filed, either by you or by the IRS itself using a substitute return calculated entirely against your interest. If you never file, the government's ability to eventually come after you never technically expires. Why it's false? People confuse the audit statute, which protects filed returns from endless re-examination, with a non-existent protection for returns that were never filed at all. Silence doesn't start a countdown, it just accumulates. Myth number 2. Living entirely off-grid and using only cash makes you financially invisible. Reality? Cash-based living reduces your digital footprint but doesn't eliminate every reporting trigger. Large cash transactions over $10,000, even in aggregate patterns, trigger currency transaction reports from banks under the Bank Secrecy Act. Buying land itself requires a deed, which is public record, tied to your legal name in nearly every U.S. county. Even off-grid land purchases, propane deliveries, vehicle registrations, and hunting or fishing licenses create a paper trail. Why it's false? Modern financial surveillance isn't a single wall you climb over. It's dozens of smaller overlapping systems, county recorders, state wildlife agencies, utility co-ops, even rural mail carriers who notice patterns, and evading all of them simultaneously for years requires a level of discipline that almost no one sustains once the isolation itself starts wearing on their judgment. Myth number 3, and this is the one I think matters most, that getting caught is the worst possible outcome. Reality? For the majority of documented long-term forest hermits and off-grid tax resistors, the actual worst outcomes weren't legal at all. They were medical emergencies with no way to get help, or years of documented cognitive and social decline from prolonged isolation, discovered only after the fact through interviews, journals, or in the grimmest cases, not discovered until much later than anyone would want to imagine. Why it's false? We fear the courtroom because it's dramatic and visible. We underestimate the slow, quiet risk because it doesn't have a headline. But the data on solo wilderness survival consistently shows that isolation-related medical and psychological deterioration, not prosecution, is the more common and more dangerous outcome of this specific fantasy. Now, and this is important, none of this means the underlying feeling that sends people toward this fantasy is irrational, or that everyone attempting a simpler, more self-reliant life is one bad decision away from a felony. There's an enormous, healthy, well-documented spectrum of homesteading, off-grid living, and intentional simplicity that people practice legally, safely, and sustainably every single day in this country, while still filing their taxes, still maintaining minimal contact with emergency services, still keeping one foot in the systems that exist specifically to keep them alive if something goes wrong. The catastrophe in today's episode isn't about wanting less complexity. It's specifically about the just stop version of that instinct, the total abrupt severance rather than the gradual deliberate one. So, let's build the actual framework, the version of this that turns the fantasy into something you can survive, or more usefully, something that helps you recognize exactly how far from that fantasy a smart, sustainable version of it actually sits. Point 1. Understand the real difference between owing and hiding. If you're behind on taxes, the IRS has multiple legal, boring, unglamorous options that do not involve prison. Installment agreements, offers in compromise for genuine financial hardship, and currently not collectible status if you demonstrably cannot pay. The overwhelming majority of tax debt in America is resolved through these channels, not prosecution. Criminal referral is reserved almost exclusively for cases involving deliberate concealment or large-scale fraud, not simple inability to pay. If the fear driving the fantasy is debt, the boring paperwork path is statistically overwhelmingly safer than disappearance. Point 2. If you're pursuing off-grid life for its own sake, not as tax evasion, but as a genuine lifestyle shift, file anyway. even from the woods. You can file a federal tax return with a rural route address, a P.O. box, or even no fixed address at all, using an IRS-recognized alternative. Filing costs you almost nothing if your income is low or non-existent, and it keeps your Social Security record and any future benefits tied to it intact. This single step alone eliminates the entire criminal exposure discussed in Act 2. Point 3. Build your caloric math before you build your cabin. Calculate your actual required intake, then calculate honestly what your land and skill level can realistically produce in year 1, not year 10 after decades of practiced expertise. Most successful off-grid transitions plan for a multi-year runway of stored, purchased, or supplemented food while skills and infrastructure develop, rather than assuming immediate self-sufficiency. Point 4. Never remove yourself from all emergency contact simultaneously. Every documented survival expert, without exception, recommends maintaining at least one reliable way to summon help: a satellite communicator, a scheduled check-in with a trusted contact, a known route to the nearest road. The isolation that makes the fantasy feel appealing is exactly the variable that turns a survivable injury into a fatal one. Point 5. Understand load-bearing shelter basics before winter, not during it. This means learning, practicing, and ideally testing your shelter design through at least one full seasonal cycle before depending on it exclusively, and building in redundancy, a backup heat source, a backup water source, a backup way to signal for help. Point 6. Keep your paper trail intentional, not accidental. If privacy is actually the goal rather than evasion, there are legal tools for that: land trusts, LLCs for property holding, and simply choosing remote, low-visibility locations that reduce your footprint without crossing into criminal concealment. Point 7. Talk to a tax professional before you talk to a real estate agent. This sounds anticlimactic, and it is deliberately, because an hour with an enrolled agent or tax attorney, even a low-cost one through a legal aid clinic, can tell you definitively whether your specific debt situation actually requires drastic action, or whether it's solvable through channels that don't require abandoning your entire life. Point 8. If isolation is genuinely part of your goal, not just its side effect, build gradual exposure into your plan rather than total severance. Extended solo research in Antarctica and long-duration spaceflight analog studies consistently show that people who maintain even minimal, scheduled social contact fare dramatically better psychologically than those who sever it completely. A monthly supply run and a 5-minute radio check-in isn't a failure of the fantasy, it's the engineering choice that lets the rest of it actually work. Point 9. Understand that the woods are not a monolith legally speaking. Federal land, state land, and private land carry entirely different rules about long-term occupation, resource gathering, and even legal residency. Squatting on federal land, for instance, carries its own separate set of civil and sometimes criminal exposure entirely apart from tax law. Know exactly whose land you're standing on and what that specifically permits. Point 10, and the one I'd argue matters most. Separate the fantasy from the function. If what you actually want is less noise, less surveillance, less administrative weight on your daily life, you can build almost all of that legally and sustainably without the single point of catastrophic failure that total disappearance represents. The people who've built genuinely peaceful, self-directed, low-footprint lives almost never did it by breaking contact completely. They did it by being deliberate about which threads they cut and which ones they kept. Let's slow down here, because this is the part of the episode where I want to stop being clinical for a second. I don't think the instinct behind this fantasy is a character flaw. I think it's an incredibly common, incredibly human response to feeling like you were a small, replaceable part inside a machine that was never built with your specific life in mind. The tax code alone runs to tens of thousands of pages. Nobody fully understands all of it. Not accountants, not IRS agents, not the people who wrote it. Feeling crushed by that, feeling the pull toward a version of life with no forms, no deadlines, no automated letters, that's not pathology. That's a reasonable response to genuine complexity. But here's the reframe, and it's the one thing I want you to actually walk away with. The system you're trying to escape and the wilderness you're imagining as the escape route are not opposites. They're both just systems, one built by people, one built by physics and biology over billions of years, and both of them have rules that don't bend just because you've decided to not acknowledge them anymore. The tax code doesn't care that you disagree with it. Hypothermia doesn't care that you disagree with it either. Neither one is interested in your intentions. Both only respond to what you actually do. And the miracle, if there is one, buried in all this data, isn't the fantasy of disappearing. It's the almost invisible amount of infrastructure that currently exists specifically so you don't have to think about any of this. Somewhere behind the wall of your home, a system delivers clean water on demand, treated to a standard that took a century of public health engineering to achieve. Somewhere in a database you've never seen, your Social Security contributions are quietly accumulating toward a future version of you who will need them more than the present version does. Somewhere down the road from wherever you're sitting right now, an ambulance exists, funded and staffed and ready, that can reach you in minutes rather than days, specifically because enough people, including you, paid into a system that makes that possible for strangers they'll never meet. That's not a cage. That's one of the strangest, most improbable achievements of the last 200 years. Millions of people who will never meet each other, quietly agreeing to fund a floor beneath everyone's feet, low enough that most of the time you don't even notice it's there until the one day you desperately need it, and it holds. The forest isn't evil either. It's just old, older than any tax code, older than any nation-state, completely indifferent to the difference between a person who belongs there and a person who simply ran out of better ideas. Respecting that indifference rather than romanticizing it is the actual first step toward any version of self-reliant life that lasts longer than a single hard winter. So if the intrusive thought ever gets loud, the one that says just walk into the trees and let them all wonder where you went, I'd ask you to sit with the feeling underneath it for a minute before you sit with the fantasy itself. Is it really the taxes, or is it the feeling of being unseen inside a system that only notices you when you owe it something? Because if it's the second one, there is a version of the life you're picturing that doesn't require abandoning every safeguard between you and the worst day of your life. It just requires being honest about which parts of the noise you actually need to cut, and which parts are quietly the reason you get to come home at all. Be deliberate. Keep one thread connected. Let the ordinary, boring, invisible parts of modern life stay exactly as invisible and unremarkable as they're supposed to be, because that's not a sign the system has you trapped. That's the sign it's working exactly as it was built to. But that's just a theory, a catastrophe theory. Thanks for not ruining your life.